Welcome back, tech fans. Ready for another deep dive into the CompTIA plus 220-1101.
Absolutely. Today we're tackling a big one, hardware. Getting a good grip on this is essential for acing that exam.
Okay, so let's talk hardware. What are we diving into specifically today?
We're going deep into RAM, storage, those motherboards, even those printer issues everyone runs into.
Sounds like we've got a lot to cover. Let's get this hardware party started. Where do we begin?
Let's start with RAM. It's that lightning-fast workspace for your computer, juggling everything you throw at it.
Right, RAM, it's like short-term memory for computers, isn't it? Was a real-world example of why enough RAM matters.
Imagine editing a 4K video with your favorite show streaming and 20 browser tabs open. That's when you need enough RAM.
Makes sense. And when it comes to the 220-1101 exam, what RAM types should I be laser focused on?
DDR4 and DDR5, they're the heavy hitters. The exam might ask you to pick them out visually, like how many pins they have.
Good point. I've definitely blanked on those before. Anything else tricky about RAM for the exam?
Don't forget about SODIMMs. They're the smaller ones you find in laptops, and their pin count is different.
Gotcha. Now let's talk storage. What are the major differences between HDDs and SSDs in a 220-1101 context?
Think of HDDs as the old-school filing cabinet, and SSDs are like having all your files instantly accessible. Speed is key for the exam.
And speaking of speed, I keep hearing about NVMe drives. What's the deal with those?
Think of NVMe as the Ferrari of storage. They use the PCIe interface, which is a superhighway for data.
So if speed is what I need, NVMe is the way to go. Now let's move on to the heart of it all, the motherboard. What should I know about them for the exam?
Think of the motherboard as your computer's nervous system, connecting everything together. It's key to know the form factors for the exam.
Form factors like ATX, micro ATX, mini ITX. How can I keep those straight in my head?
Picture the sizes. ATX is the biggest, common in desktop towers.
Hmm.
Mini ITX is the smallest for compact builds. Micro ATX sits right in between.
Okay, that helps. But there's more to motherboards than form factors, right?
Absolutely. You've got your expansion slots, and this is where knowing your PCIe from your PCI matters. PCIe is the newer, faster one.
So if I'm building a gaming PC with a top-of-the-line graphics card, I'm going for those PCIe slots, right?
Exactly. PCIe lanes are like those super highways for your data. The more lanes, the faster the data can travel. A high-end graphics card will need all the speed it can get.
Gotcha. PCIe lanes, check. Now let's move on to the brain of the operation, the CPU. What are some must-knows about CPUs for the 220-1101?
Think about the cores. More cores mean more power, especially for multitasking. It's like having multiple processors working together.
So more cores mean more processing power. Does that mean a dual-core CPU can't handle demanding tasks?
Not really, it depends. A dual core can still be powerful, especially with a high clock speed and enough cache memory. It's all about finding the right balance for your needs.
So it's like choosing between a nimble sports car and a powerful truck. Each has its own strengths. What about that hardware-assisted virtualization thing I saw?
Great question. That lets your CPU run multiple operating systems at once, each in its own little virtual world.
Like having a separate Windows and Linux environment on the same computer. That's wild. And speaking of virtual, okay, feeling like I could build a computer from scratch now. But the 220-1101 exam isn't all desktops, right? What about those mobile devices everyone carries around?
You're absolutely right. Mobile devices are everywhere, and the exam knows that. Wouldn't it be awesome to really understand what's happening inside your phone the next time it acts up?
Ugh, don't even get me started on those confusing error messages. What should I be studying about mobile devices for this exam?
Displays are a good place to start. You've got your LCDs and OLEDs. Imagine OLED as millions of tiny light bulbs, while LCD is like shining a flashlight through a colored filter.
So OLED would be the winner for those super rich colors you see in those high-end phones.
Exactly. Deeper blacks, more vibrant colors. But it's not all about the looks. The exam will also cover connectivity, how those devices talk to each other.
So we're talking about Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Speaking of Bluetooth, it can be such a pain sometimes.
Tell me about it. The exam might even ask you to troubleshoot Bluetooth problems. Imagine a user trying to pair their wireless earbuds, but the phone's just not seeing them.
First thing I'd check is if Bluetooth is even switched on, right? Then I'd make sure the earbuds are in pairing mode. It's usually something simple, but yeah, super frustrating when it happens. And what's the deal with all those different charging ports? Feels like every phone has a different one.
Right. You've got your Lightning connectors for Apple devices, the classic micro USB, and then USB Type-C, which seems to be taking over the world.
Thank goodness for that. No more digging through a drawer full of cables just to find the right one. Speaking of potential cable nightmares,
Printers?
am I right? They're always finding new ways to stop working?
You're telling me. The 220-1101 focuses on inkjet and laser printers. Think of inkjets as tiny squirt guns spraying ink onto paper, and lasers as using a more complex process with toner, like a copier.
Okay, that's a good way to remember it. So inkjet for casual home use. Laser for those high-volume print jobs where you need things done fast and looking sharp.
Spot on. The exam might ask something like, a laser printer is spitting out blank pages. What do you suspect is wrong?
If there's no ink on the page, it's probably the toner cartridge, right? Maybe the imaging drum isn't doing its job and transferring the toner properly.
Exactly, see? You're a natural. Now, let's not forget about all the other peripherals out there. Keyboards, mice, monitors, you name it.
The unsung heroes that we totally take for granted until they decide to stop working. What's important to remember about these external devices for the exam?
Connectivity is key. Knowing your USBs from your HDMIs is crucial. Like, which one would you use to hook up a monitor to a computer?
HDMI, right. The high-definition all-star. It's the go-to for audio and video.
Exactly. The exam might ask you to troubleshoot a monitor that's not displaying anything. What would be your first steps?
Well, the obvious stuff first, right? Is it plugged in? Is the HDMI cable connected properly on both ends? And then I'd probably check the input source on the monitor itself. Sometimes it's something that simple.
You're on a roll. Those simple checks can save you a lot of headache. But don't forget about what's going on inside those peripherals, too. Think about keyboards, for example. Mechanical versus membrane, what's the difference, and why would a gamer prefer one over the other?
Mechanical keyboards, they're famous for that clicky feedback and their durability, right?
Right. Each key has its own little mechanical switch, which is why they're so popular with gamers and programmers who spend hours typing. Membrane keyboards are more common, more affordable.
Oh, I'm definitely a fan of that mechanical keyboard click. But let's move on to something a little more mysterious. BIOS and UEFI. To be honest, they kind of intimidate me.
Don't worry, they're not as scary as they sound. Think of BIOS or UEFI as the backstage crew making sure everything is set before the main show your operating system starts.
So they're like the stagehands, making sure the lights are working, the microphones are on, that kind of thing.
Exactly. They perform something called POSD, the Power On Self-Test. It's like a quick health check every time you turn on your computer.
Makes sense. So when would I actually need to go into BIOS or UEFI? Is that something I should be doing often?
Not every day, but it's good to know how, especially for troubleshooting or specific system configurations. Like, if you want to boot from a USB drive to install a new OS, you'd change the boot order in BIOS or UEFI.
Oh, yeah. I remember having to do that when I reinstalled my OS a while back. Felt like I was going into the deepest, most secret part of my computer.
It can feel like that, but trust me, it's not that complicated once you get used to it. And UEFI is like the modern, more user-friendly version of BIOS.
So UEFI is like using a smartphone with a touch screen, while BIOS is like using an old flip phone. Any other big differences for the exam?
You got it. UEFI has that graphical interface, supports those larger hard drives, and even has better security features.
Okay, UEFI is going on my study list for sure. Now, can we talk about virtualization? Being able to run multiple operating systems on one machine always seemed like magic to me.
It's a game changer, right? Imagine it like this. Virtualization is like having multiple apartments in one building. Each virtual machine is its own self-contained unit with its own OS and apps.
So I could have one with Windows 10 for work stuff, one with Linux for coding, maybe even one with an older Windows, just for fun.
Exactly. And it's super efficient because you're basically sharing one computer's resources across multiple virtual environments.
And the landlord managing all these virtual apartments is the hypervisor, right?
That's the one. The hypervisor makes sure everyone has what they need and that nobody's causing trouble. It's all about maximizing resources.
What about common uses for virtualization? What should I know for the 220A1101?
The exam might ask about server virtualization, where you run multiple virtual servers on one physical server. It's huge for businesses and data centers because it saves a ton of money on hardware and electricity.
Makes sense. Why have a room full of servers when you can do the same thing with just a few powerful machines and virtualization?
Exactly. Plus, it's easier to manage and scale everything with virtualization.
Okay, virtualization is definitely a fascinating topic. It's amazing what we can do with technology these days.
It really is. And it shows that even in our increasingly virtual world, understanding the basics of hardware is more important than ever.
Well said. Are there any other hardware-related concepts I should be thinking about for the 2201101?
We've covered a ton, but there's always more to learn. Different types of cooling systems, the importance of preventative maintenance, troubleshooting hardware issues.
Sounds like we have material for another deep dive.
Ah,
All right, back for more hardware adventures. We've covered a ton, but what about keeping those computers running cool?
we talked about CPUs, but the 220.1101 also wants you to know about cooling solutions for the entire system.
Right, it's not just about preventing a meltdown, it's about keeping those components happy for the long haul.
Exactly. Heat is the enemy. The exam might ask you to compare air cooling versus liquid cooling.
Okay, so air cooling, that's your fans and heat sinks. And liquid cooling, that's for those high-performance systems that really push the limits. What kind of curveball could the exam throw at me on this?
How about this? A gamer wants to build a PC with a top-tier CPU and GPU. They're worried about overheating. What do you recommend?
Well, for a setup like that, liquid cooling is the way to go, right? It can handle much more heat than traditional air cooling.
You got it. Always choose the right tool for the job. Speaking of which, let's move on to preventative maintenance. It's like the unsung hero of the hardware world.
Preventative maintenance, it's like eating your vegetables. It's all about preventing problems before they even happen.
Exactly. Think of it as a regular checkup for your computer. The exam might ask about things like keeping your system clean, updating drivers, running malware scans.
Good advice for any computer user, really. But what happens when, despite our best efforts, hardware decides to act up?
That's where troubleshooting comes in. This is where all that hardware knowledge we've been talking about really shines.
Time to put on our detective hats and figure out what's going on. What are some common troubleshooting tricks for the exam?
They'll want to see if you can think on your feet. You might see scenarios with POST cards, those beep codes, maybe even the dreaded blue screen of death. It's all about staying calm, ruling out potential problems, and knowing where to look for clues.
Okay, those scenarios sound a little intense, but kind of exciting at the same time. There's something satisfying about fixing a hardware issue.
Absolutely. And once you've diagnosed and fixed the problem, that sense of accomplishment is the best reward. Plus, you'll be everyone's go-to tech support hero.
That's a valuable skill to have. Well, this hardware deep dive has been amazing. We've covered RAM, BIOS, mobile devices, even preventative maintenance. I feel like I'm ready to tackle that 220.1101 exam.
You've got this. Just keep practicing, stay curious, and you'll be well on your way to becoming a certified tech pro.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us. We hope you learned a lot and had some fun along the way. Don't miss our next episode where we'll dive into the world of networking. Until then, happy computing.